Good morning, good evening, good afternoon for everyone. My name is Tatiana Cohen, and this is podcast Happy at Work. Usually in our podcast, we meet with guests from different countries and discuss an important topic, people-centered approach in our business. And today my guest with a wonderful expert in well-being. I think employee well-being now is a very hot topic for all countries because we are living in a so fast-changing world with a lot of with a lot of stress. And now we need to fix more on our well-being. And I'm happy to see here Jessica Grossmeier. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon.
Yeah, I think it's because we have guests of our live stream from a different country, so it could be different part of the day, but also for our YouTube channel, it also could be time it's appropriate to watch this important topic as well. But before we starting, Jessica, first let's call my guests to make a short self introduction because I'm absolutely sure the people who will watch you on our podcast later want to follow you at least on LinkedIn. So it could be interesting to know more about you and your huge professional background.
Yeah, so I have been in the workplace well-being field my entire professional career. I started 30 years ago, which is kind of hard to believe. And back then, the focus was largely on physical fitness and stress management. I have been started out as a practitioner of workplace well-being programs and implementing them in workplaces. But then I discovered research and I spent the next 25 years of my career focusing on how do we identify best practice approaches to effective health and well-being programs at the workplace. I also did return on investment studies to demonstrate the value and the business case for why we would want to invest in workplace well-being. I am now back to being a practitioner and translating research into practices by writing books, speaking at conferences, and generally getting the word out that there is a lot of research that can help us to understand how to promote well being at work. And we just need to apply that research more effectively.
Jessica, I know what your practice well-being for a lot of time, and also talk about it. You have at least two books, which I think we could also mention during our conversation. And my first question is, what do you inspire in the topic of well-being? Why did you decide some years ago to walk in this area?
Yeah, so I have been a wellness aficionado my entire life, starting back in my teens in sports. And so when I discovered I could make a career out of bringing well being to the workplace, it was a no brainer for me. I was all in. But what really inspired my interest in more meaningful work is a bit of a different story. So, as I said, when we first started out in the health and well-being field 30 years ago, the focus was largely on physical fitness and stress management. And it wasn't until I experienced burnout and disengagement in a leadership role 15 years ago that I first started to think about other dimensions of well-being, such as mental, emotional, and spiritual. And we weren't talking about burnout and disengagement like as much back then, so it took me a while to figure out how to navigate my way back to personal and professional thriving. So, 5 years ago, I took a career sabbatical and I explored the research that supported the practices that I used in my own life to be more holistic in my own approach to my well being. And I ended up writing my first book, which calls for a broader approach to workplace well being, one that really gets to the underlying issues of how do we find meaningful and fulfillment in our work.
I want to ask you about the conceptual well-being because, as I see for last years, especially after the pandemic, this conception has really developed very fast. What now do you see the most important for topics for well-being at workplace? What companies and leaders, HR managers should focus on?
Yeah. So, as I said, traditional approaches did focus more on physical and maybe stress management, but we've also been focusing more on the individual in the field, education and resources that support the individual in making the right choices to support their well-being. But there's been a growing understanding over maybe the past 20 years that leadership behaviors, company policy, the physical environment, and social norms are also a really important part of well being at work. And so, leading organizations, those who are on the best employers to work for list every year, they understand that there are so many aspects of our modern work that actually influence our well being and our happiness. And this includes things like how our jobs are designed, whether we have flexibility and autonomy at work, and our relationship with our manager. People say we don't quit jobs, we quit bosses, right? So we're starting to realize that, yes, the apps for meditation at work and yoga classes and physical fitness and healthy foods at work are all very, very important. But we also need to address these other aspects of workforce and in how we work in order to address well being at work.
You mentioned burnout. I think now we have a lot of organization and a lot of people. So it's two sides from the organization perspective and from a personal perspective. The burnout at the workplace and how it impacts. Could you please share your opinion? What problem we could have if we don't think about burnout, especially we talk about employees? And what could we do for preventing it, for helping our employees and helping them to live a more healthy life?
Yeah, yeah. So when we fail to address burnout at work, obviously we see turnover. We see people who take mental health leave from work, and it might be a long time before they get back. And so, if we can work upstream and prevent people from burning out in the first place, it can help us to keep people at work and it can help keep us from turnover. So, there really is a business case for addressing this. And in terms of how we address it, it's not just, oh, people need to take a long weekend or they need to take more breaks. In order to truly address burnout, we need to address the job demands versus the resources side of things because burnout is actually a systems issue, not just an individual issue. The reason we get to burnout is because we have been overlooking. We've not been prioritizing and clarifying what's most important. And so people feel like everything's important and they have to do all the things. And so helping people to prioritize, this is what needs to be addressed first. And then maybe we offload some of the other things to another team member or we deprioritize things. It could be increasing social support at work. When employees feel like they can go to their supervisor and feel like they really are supported, and if they've got need clarity or if they need higher priorities or that the supervisor really cares about them, that actually makes a difference in terms of how people feel like they can bring more energy into their work. So it's extremely important that we look at how can we design jobs so that we are reducing demand and giving people more capacity to sustain high performance, but we can also do things like increase social support at work, and those things help as well.
I really like then you mentioned redesigning work. So now we have a lot of discussion about future work and how it could change. And what now a lot of organizations, especially because it's also impact of AI and also impact of our world, a lot of organizations start to think about redesigning work process. What could you recommend to the companies who want to build the sustainable organization, the organization which really care about employees, which really think about people-centered approach as a long-term contract with employees? What could you recommend to these organizations?
Well, this could be a very long conversation. So I'm going to focus on one area that I've been talking about quite a bit, and that is our relationships with one another at work, with our coworkers. So when we go to work, a lot of times we're in back to back meetings all day long. And the focus is on how do we get the job done? What's on the agenda? And it's very transactional. But if we can come into, say, a regular ongoing meeting and we can start with just a little bit of, hey, how are you doing on the other side of this screen? And what's going on in your life or what's inspiring you at work? Anytime we give people a chance to share what's going on in their lives, that actually builds internal energy and it makes us more excited about what we're doing. And it seems like such a small thing, but we're not really designing our meetings, for example, to promote this kind of a connection where we can actually say, well, what did you do this weekend or what's going on in your life? So something that small focusing on bringing more intentionality into seeing one another as human beings and not just your job and your role on the team, that actually builds internal energy. It helps us to feel more satisfied and fulfilled in what we're doing. At the end of the day, you're probably not going to remember all the things that you ticked off on your checklist.
Mm.
What you're going to remember is the story that somebody shared with you, right? Or the laugh that you had with somebody that you were working alongside. So, those are the things that really give us joy and help us to feel more fulfilled in our work. And that actually helps to sustain our performance and helps us to lean into whatever we're doing.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with you. What we need to focus on the connection, but the other side, what I see now, we are living in a world of hybrid work or remote work, and also we have a lot of people, especially there are a lot of young people who feel themselves frustrated because they don't have a strong connection with colleagues, don't have a lot of friends, and so on. What a really company could do for the employees, what leader, it's interesting not only from a company's perspective with a systemic approach, absolutely agree what it's important, but also from a leader perspective, a leader of the team. What could they do for helping employees to feel themselves better in perspective to decrease this feeling of loneliness? It's feeling what you are not a part of this community, society, and so on. What recommendation could you give as a wonderful well-being coach?
Yeah. So there are really so many things that you can do. One of them is to make sure that you do have regular check ins with your employees. And if you're a leader of a team, making sure that you have, even if it's just 30 minutes on a somewhat regular basis, so that people know that, oh, this is time when I can actually connect with the leader of the team. You can answer questions, that sort of thing. But the temptation is to make those meetings all about checking in on the performance and how things are going. It's important to make time, maybe even just at the start of the call, maybe write yourself a note and ask them about something that might have been going on in their life. If they've just come back from vacation, how was your vacation? Take 5 minutes and talk about that. It's so often that we skip over that. We jump right to the agenda. I know when I worked on a remote team, there were 7 of us all over the country in the United States, and we only met remotely. And so every week, the leader of our team would be very intentional about just doing some type of a round robin. Like, if you were a weather forecast, what would the weather be like today?
Mhm.
Or one day she had us all run down to the kitchen and grab our favorite cooking gadget and come back and do a little show and tell with, what is your favorite gadget in the kitchen and why? And we actually bonded over that because we shared some of the same gadgets. So this doesn't have to take a lot of time. It can be just a few minutes, but it's opening with that intention of recognizing and acknowledging that there are people on the other side of the screen. And we can also do things like we can create Slack channels that help team members to stay connected with one another. We can create like little prompts that can help them maybe share what's going on in their lives. Like, hey, share one thing that made you smile today. And they can just share that in the Slack channel. It doesn't have to take a
Mhm.
lot of time for people to do that. So those little things can actually add up and accumulate so that we feel more connected to one another.
Jessica, I couldn't avoid this question. What gives you some positive minutes today and make you smile? This is very interesting question. What, for example, for your side, and what could you recommend to other people fix in their lives for increasing the positive emotion?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do every day is I go for a little walk around my neighborhood. It's just a loop. I do the exact same loop every single day. But when I do that loop, I try to take a look and say, well, if I were to come up with my awe moment, what would
Mhm.
it be? And I'll take a picture sometimes. I'll see something new that's blooming, a flower or something like that. It might be an animal that I see when I'm walking. It might be a neighbor that I see. And I try to just look for those little surprises in my day. And so I'm constantly trying to look for those things. And when we're intentional about looking for those things, trying to spot joy, as I say, joy spotting,
Mhm.
we're actually more likely to see the world around us better. It's about literally stopping and smelling the roses every once in a while and being like, oh, wow, I didn't even realize that this plant was here. And I do this same walk every single day. So it's about noticing those things and kind of getting out of our head a little bit. It shifts our perspective and it helps me to come back and have more energy to dig back into my work again. So I try to do that every day.
Absolutely, it's very interesting, but it's not so huge the things. It could be small things which could improve your habits when you start to think about these small important things. Jessica also mentioned it's about positive emotions from every day, about relationship, and that you could share with other people this positive emotion and for building them stronger relationship. And what else in the beginning you mentioned what it's important, the sense of meaning, the sense of our side to talk about sense of belonging, but also a sense of meaning, the meaningful work. What does it mean for you? What do you think? Is it important for our well-being at workplace? And what could we do with this sense of meaning?
Yeah, so I think in terms of finding meaning in our work, there are a couple of different ways that we can be intentional about this. One is to take some time and reflect on what matters most to you, not just at work, but outside of work. Really think about what that is or what your values are. And when we think about those things, and then we start to reflect on, well, how could I bring my values or my priorities into the work that I'm doing? So, for example, I used to have this grand purpose statement for my work. And what I realized is it isn't what I do for work that matters, it's how I approach it that matters. And so I did some work and I started to think about my values. And what I came up with is a new purpose statement, which is how do I express care for other people? How do I be more generous and other focused? How do I be more service oriented in my work? When I start my workday, I look at my calendar and I reflect on what do I have going on and how do I bring that purpose, those values into how I do my work. And so I might think about how can I be fully present? How can I remove distractions when I'm having an important conversation with somebody? Or it could be something like how do I bring a more service orientation into this work that I'm about to do? Those brief moments when we just pause and anchor what we're doing with our values, that's a way of deepening our sense of purpose. And if you are a leader of teams, you can ask people to share what are the things that matter most to you in life? What are the things that you prioritize, not just at work, but outside of work? And what does it look like to bring that value or that priority into how you approach your job? When we can share that with other people, that deepens our sense of purpose as well. So simply asking the question of ourselves or of one another actually helps to deepen our sense of purpose. And research shows that when we have those little bits of connection to what we're doing and why it matters, that actually makes all the difference in terms of the energy we bring into the job that we're doing. So our performance is better.
Jessica, my next question is about is resilience. We discussed positive emotion, we discussed the well-being approach, burnout. So, and resilience is it's also a very important part of our life now. And I know what a lot of employees now ask, how could you improve your resilience? Because resilience is a way for keeping our productivity independently on the situation and the cases in our work. What does it mean for your resilience? And what the company leader and the person could do for improving this ability for resilience.
So you're talking about resilience, correct?
Resilience, yes.
Resilience, correct. So, when I've already mentioned this a couple of times, but I'm going to mention it again because when we look at the resilience literature, one of the things that pops up over and over and over again is social support. And so, really helping one another to develop stronger relationships at work is something that can build our resilience. As I said, when we are not getting along with our coworkers, it can make our hard day feel even harder. And when we have strong supportive relationships at work, it actually can help be the buffer that makes a challenging day feel easier. And so, what can we do to build trust and stronger relationships at work? One of the researchers that I've been following for a while is at the University of Michigan Center for Positive Organizations. They've been studying how to build higher quality connections at the workplace for decades, and they've been linking that to things like more resilience and higher performance at work. And what they found is that we need to bring micro moments of connection into our transactions or our interactions with one another at work. And so these are things like when you have a video call or when you encounter people in the workplace, actually smile and wave. Hi, say their name. If you don't know their name, ask them their name. Maybe if you already know their name, someday you can ask them, what's the story of your name? How do you know why your parents gave you that name?
Mhm.
People light up when you ask this question. And a lot of times they have a really interesting story behind it. So it helps us, again, just to build a stronger bond with one another. We can also use positive language. Actually say please and thank you, not just when you're asking for something, but when you are just sending an email. You
Mhm.
can let people know, hey, thank you so much for getting back to me. Can you please clarify this point? It sounds like such a simple thing, but research shows that these things matter. They help people to feel like, oh, what I'm doing here is valued, it's seen, and I matter. And people, the other person respects me as a person. Those things all increase our resilience at work.
Jessica, my next question is coming from a previous because I made a mistake when I say resilience because it's natural for people to make mistakes. And I want to ask you, what could you recommend for people when, for example, made mistakes in their work? Usually people make mistakes at work. What could you recommend? How we could handle these mistakes as leaders and as a person? Because in one side, it could lead us, especially perfectionists, people who have
Mhm.
tendency to be perfectionists. They have a big problem with mistakes, with making mistakes, because they have a lot of fears. You really worry, you ruminate all your mistakes. Oh, why did I do that or that? Another side, also from company, we could have different situation. For one leader could say you shouldn't make any mistakes. I remember when I discussed it's about, for example, language, because for English, for me, it's not my native language. And I discussed it from one colleague. She said, you should not, for example, launch a podcast before you start to speak brilliant. I said, I'm a person who want to launch podcast. And for me, it's a great stress from one side. From another side, it's a great interest to work with, to connect with other people. And what is your recommendation? How should we, as a person, work with our mistakes? And how should we, as a leaders, because it could impact our performance from one side. From the other side, it's also impact our personality and our well-being. What are your recommendations?
So I'm a recovering perfectionist. So I have a lot of experience giving myself a hard time. So I think there are a couple different approaches. First of all, I think one of the things that we're learning from neuroscience is that when we label something that's happened, we label what we've done as a failure, it actually activates a portion of the brain called the habenula. It's this little tiny structure in the brain that you need a serious microscope to be able to see. And when that gets activated, it actually helps us to lose all our motivation. We just want to quit, right? And so it's extremely important for us not to activate that center of the brain. And what neuroscience shows us is the way we can keep that suppressed and keep it turned off, that failure switch, is to actually think of it as a data point. Think of it as an iteration. This didn't work. Great. I know that didn't work. Let me get quickly to the thing that will. Let me try something differently. And so it's a reframe in our mind. It's not a failure, it's a data point. That particular thing didn't go the way that I wanted. Let's treat it as an experiment. What can I do differently to try something different? And we pivot. And so that's one thing is we develop this iterative mindset. The second thing is that we can develop a little bit more compassion for ourselves first and foremost because it's the stories that we tell ourselves about the failure that's actually what's so damaging, right? It doesn't become I messed up here. It's all of a sudden we start to label, right? And we provide all of this negative energy towards ourselves. And that actually doesn't help us at all. Instead, if we can have a little bit of compassion and say, oh, I messed up, that's okay. I'm going to get right back out there and I'm going to try this another way. And so developing compassion for ourselves can also be important. And when we do that, it allows us to extend more compassion to other people. So we can help to understand, well, maybe this person's having an off day. Maybe there were some circumstances leading into this interaction that made a decision a little bit more challenging or something. And so if we can be more compassionate with ourselves, it allows us to be more compassionate with other people and recognize, hey, we're all human. We're just doing the best that we can. And how can we just lean into, all right, we're going to just try this another way. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Keep moving forward.
I absolutely agree with you. What we need more compassion, especially now, and especially if you have tendency to be a perfectionist. My next question is about it's interesting joy and joy killer. We talked about positive moments of your life and how it could help you to keep smile and share these positive moments with your colleagues, for example, with your friends, family members. And outside, I want to discuss it joy. Joy at work. What do you think about it? And also, what are joy killers of our work? And what should they do with joy killers?
Yeah. So there's this interesting actual area of research that helps us to understand that when we're enjoying what we do, when we feel good about it, we actually do it better. It's not this, I mean, it sounds such a squishy thing. Well, we shouldn't enjoy our work. It's work, right? It's called work for a reason. But um, there was a psychologist that you may have heard of, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he spent his career studying flow. This is the feeling of when you're so absorbed in something that you lose track of time. And he found that when people are in this state, they do their most creative and exciting work. And so, how do we create the experience of flow? And how do we experience more joy at work? A lot of times it's around removing distractions. Being fully present in what you're doing is actually something that can help increase our joy and our satisfaction in doing it. And so turning off all those little notifications, telling yourself, you know what, for this next 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I'm just going to do this thing. I'm not going to worry about my email. I'm not going to worry about Slack notifications. I'm just going to focus on this thing. And when we actually create opportunities for ourselves and others to create those little containers of focused work time, that's actually the biggest way to increase joy and engagement and flow in one's work. And so that's one thing that's really critical. Things that are joy killers at work, you asked about. I think one of the things that I talked about is meeting culture, back to back transactional meetings with no breathing room for human transaction or human connection. That's one way, but it's also appreciation and recognition. When we don't take the time to recognize and appreciate the other person that we're working with, people take it for granted. They feel like they're invisible, and it's demoralizing. So acknowledging what other people have done. Hey, thanks so much just for the energy you brought into the room today. Thanks so much for the smile you brought in. It gave me an uplift. Those are things that help people to say, oh, the person actually sees me and they value me as a person, not just for what I do. And when we fail to do that and we just go about our day all day long, not appreciating or recognizing other people, that actually kills joy at work. And so we need to be very intentional about that.
Jessica, my next question is interesting. I know what for every meeting with any other persons, and especially I know also what you have a lot of a group conversation with leaders, also a lot of presentations. During these conversations, times to times, people also ask you something on or share their insights. What was maybe the unusual thing for you? Unusual cases, unusual insights, or you think it's everybody understand it? But a person come to you said, for example, that it's work. They never should smile at work. Another should have joy at work. And maybe a person come to you and said, my father all the time said maybe a job should be, you should be very serious, but you let me smile. And maybe that could be the biggest insight of this person. So could you share from your practice? Maybe something situation. I think it's important for the leaders for understanding for maybe the all insights are valued. And sometimes maybe something what was so important for you would also change your life, your approach as a well-being expert.
Yeah, so I'm gonna share a story about my mom. She always wanted to be a singer, a professional singer. And so she pursued that outside of work, and she worked in a manufacturing setting for a number of years. And I asked her, I'm like, "Mom, Well, how do you find the energy and the joy to do this every single day? And she said, well, I just focus on being of service to other people. And I focus on how I can make someone's day better because the job is hard, right? But what can I do to actually make that job easier for somebody else that I'm working alongside? And so she just brought that attitude to work every single day. And for her, it's what gave her joy because she ended up having fantastic relationships at work. You know, when she turned 40, they put a big sign outside the plant where she worked and said, Lordy, Lordy, Tony's 40, right? And, that just made her feel so special. That's what bringing this kind of intention into our work can actually do. It helps us to build this positive network of relationship that is really what makes the difference in our lives. And so I have brought that same kind of thinking into my work as I've gone on. There's always going to be something about our job that we don't like or that we don't enjoy. And when I'm only focusing on, well, what do I want to do? What makes me happy? It's actually harder to find joy and meaning in our work. But when I turn that outside of myself and I say, how can I make your job easier? Right? That actually is what can transform how I approach the work. And it's what helps us to feel like what we're doing is making a difference. So I always think back to how my mom thinks about work. And even though she was doing something like it's hard, it's challenging, she just shifted how she thought about it. And I try to think about that when I'm doing work that might feel unpleasant or unsatisfying. I'm like, no, no, no. All I have to do is change my frame. And that's what's going to make me kind of lean in and get more satisfaction out of doing it.
Jessica, thanks for sharing this story because I think it's a lot of this type of stories, feeling of different emotions is very important for us for understanding that firstly what we're promoting, I need to stay human, to be human for all your life, not only at family. So
Mhm.
also at work, and the more that you are human, the more impact you could have for your life and for your work, for your productivity, and for your team. It's also important for me from the leader's perspective. Time is coming so fast, and I have a last but very important question for you. I know what some leaders will listen us, and I know what all leaders like when they give advice. To summarize our conversation today, and we mentioned a lot of important topic. What three main tips could you give to the leaders who want to reimagine their well-being at work, want to reimagine their workplaces and make them more human-centered?
Yeah. So I think it starts with being very intentional about understanding what are the things that matter most to me and how can I bring some of that into my work and align it with my work? And that could be values, for example. The second thing is to think about relationships. How do I want people to see me as a human? How can I bring and reveal just a little bit more of my humanity with my team? And that could be sometimes admitting when we don't know the answer. It could be admitting when I'm not really sure I like the way things are going, but let's do our best. So that can be a way. And then I think the third thing is how do we spot joy in our own lives, in our own work? Can we start to look for those little moments of filling ourselves up or those little moments of uplift or energy? And how can we bring more of that into our work? If we're intentional about those three things, our values, showing up more human and interacting, and then spotting joy at work, that's actually going to make us better leaders and more effective leaders.
Jessica, thanks a lot for all insights. Thanks a lot for sharing all the cases, ideas during our conversation. I hope also that people could follow us, and I would be happy if you post maybe links for your book in our page of our podcast for sharing it for our audience. Thanks a lot for your participation.
Yeah, thanks so much. Have a really great day.
Thank you. And this is podcast Happy at Work. My name is Tatiana Koval. Stay connected.